curious about why some people are more likely to develop problems with addiction than others. I'm Danielle Dick. I am the director of the Rutgers Addiction Research Center, and I am a professor of psychiatry at Rutgers Robert Wood Johnson Medical School and the Greg Brown Endowed Chair in Neuroscience.
So can you tell me more about your work and like what you do on a day-to-day basis and what you're looking at? I mean, part of what you're curious about is what your job is, but also maybe it's a little bit more complicated than that.
Yes. So broadly, I study how our genes and our environments come together to shape our life paths. And a lot of my work focuses on addiction and mental health outcomes. So I lead large international gene identification efforts where we're actually identifying the specific genes involved in why some people are more at risk for developing substance use disorders and other mental health challenges. I then do a number of longitudinal studies of kids. So, kids that we follow from very early in development through adulthood. And we're looking at what does genetic risk look like as people grow up and what kinds of environments either exacerbate or reduce risk. And then what we ultimately want to do is use all of this information to develop more tailored prevention, intervention, and treatment.
Could you share maybe one of the studies that you're working on lately or that has been published lately that you think would be helpful for people to hear about?
Absolutely. So we have a study that I'm very excited about that we are submitting to Nature just this week, and it's the Large Gene Identification Consortium that I lead. And so we have now amassed data from over 3 million individuals. It's almost 4 million individuals around the world. And what we're able to do is to essentially scan the genome. And we have identified more than 1,200 locations that either increase or decrease risk just a little bit, each one on their own. But what we can do is we can add them all up and then we weight each one by how big of an effect it has. And we can create for any individual a genetic risk score. We call these polygenic scores. And essentially, what they do is they measure how much of a genetic predisposition you have to a particular outcome. And what this big gene identification project is looking at is outcomes related to impulsivity and compulsivity. And so we started out studying substance use disorders or being interested in substance use disorders. But what we found is that the same genes that influence the likelihood that an individual will develop a substance use disorder also show up as impulsivity in little kids, as ADHD and other behavior problems, as other risky behaviors, risk taking, risky sex, as well as risky substance use. So that's what we're working on right now. And this has really radically advanced our understanding of how our genes influence not just substance use outcomes, but other kinds of behavioral addictions and behavioral challenges more broadly.
That's so interesting as you're saying that I was recalling this kind of popular test that was, I think, shared more broadly about children and their ability to eat the cookie or not eat the cookie. Whether that's kind of one of those tests and without maybe at that time being able to do a DNA test to be able to see that impulsivity, that was maybe one of the alternative ways. What do you think about kind of those type of tests that are easily tested for people to see versus a DNA test to tell them the same thing?
Yes, so that was a famous set of studies called the marshmallow experiments, where they were exactly looking to see, in young children, preschoolers and kindergartners, could they wait to get two marshmallows or did they immediately eat the one? If they waited while staring at this tasty treat, which could have been a marshmallow or a cookie or, other kind of treat that the child chose, if they could wait and they didn't, sort of impulsively eat that treat, then they got two. And what this gets at is something that is related to many kinds of life outcomes, which is how our brains are wired toward reward seeking. So, what we know is that our genes influence the way that our brains are wired. And so, in the same way that we can look around and see all kinds of differences between us on the outside, there are all kinds of differences on the inside too. And we know that intuitively in terms of why some people are more at risk for cardiovascular diseases or cancers, but our brains are actually wired very differently. And that's why you can see all these differences between people and everything from impulsivity to kind of anxiety proneness to the things we call personality to mental health challenges and outcomes. So, this idea that our brains are wired differently toward processing rewards and risks, we know that that is actually one of the things that can predispose toward a variety of impulsive outcomes, and substance use being one of them.
So this brings the talk maybe around also to this idea of parenting, right? And you have written the book that is behind you, The Child Code. Can you tell me more about this book and what it's about?
So, this book came because when I had my son, I found myself, oh, the irony, raising the high risk child that I study. Highly impulsive, highly emotional, very low on behavioral and self regulation. And so, really, I wrote this book because for the first time, I started paying attention to what was out there in mainstream parenting literature. And there's a lot about skills, strategies, things parents should and could do. But there's almost nothing about the role that genetics plays in kids' behavior. And I think that's because people think, like, oh, well, what am I supposed to do about that? That's not helpful information to me as a parent. But I actually think that's wrong, and that by not paying attention to the role of genes in our kids' behavior, we make it harder on ourselves because it can lead to a lot of self judgment, right? And doubt. It can lead to, candidly, judgment of other parents too. When we see, that impulsive child who's throwing a fit in Target or in the grocery store, and, we think, oh, that parent really needs to, insert your favorite parenting advice here. Uh, and not only that, but because our kids are all wired differently, they have brains that, work differently. It means that one size fits all parenting, in fact, doesn't work equally effectively for all kids. So, when we are mindful and pay attention to how our kids are wired, what we can essentially do is help accentuate their natural strengths, help us and them realize the good things that can come along with some of those characteristics, because there is good and not so good associated with everything, and also help them realize what might be potential challenges or pitfalls, and then put in place support systems there.
Maybe you can share some of those tests or ways to find out, what is the character or what is the type of your child? I mean, what were the main things that someone would look at, would a parent look at, and how would they assess whether their child is impulsive or whatever else they're able to look at?
Yeah, so I call them the three E's. And this is not something straight out of the scientific literature. This is my kind of heuristic for helping remember these three big dimensions. So the first one is extroversion. And so we know that extroversion, or sometimes on the other end, introversion, uh, is distributed like a bell curve. All of these characteristics that I'll talk about, they're all distributed like a bell curve in the population, which means that when parents are like, oh, is this behavior normal? Well, it's normal to have people spread all over, all across that distribution. Extroversion is something we talk a lot about in adults. Are you an extrovert? Are you an introvert? How that shapes what you want to do and spend your time. We don't talk about it nearly as much in kids, but it shows up very early on. And these can be places where, if we're not mindful of it, then it can cause some real friction points. So the second one is emotionality. So we know that some kids are more prone toward higher levels of fear, frustration. And so all kids display these behaviors sometimes. But the way we can start to think about, like, oh, is this something about the way my child's brain is wired? And maybe this is, a trait rather than just kind of a state, if you will, is do you see the behavior consistently across time, across different settings, and different people are seeing it as well, too? So, the child who gets really frightened and maybe hides behind your leg when there's a dog growling at them, that's normal. The child who, when you're walking down the street, is hiding behind your leg when, any friendly little dog passes, and when you're trying to do drop off at school, and when, they meet a new person who comes to the door, etc. You might think, oh, this is a child who's higher on emotionality. We know that this can be one of the most challenging things for parents. Sometimes we talk about these kids having big feelings, things that seem disproportionate to the situation. And it can manifest both as fear, frustration, but also as, because they often don't have the cognitive ability to realize or talk about what's going on, in big temper tantrums too. So emotionality is another dimension. And then the last one is related to kind of where we started. It's effortful control, or what we sometimes call self control, self regulation. And it shows up as impulsivity, as risk taking. So these are the kids that are, climbing to the top of the trees and screaming, "Look at me!" and, jumping off of the playground equipment and giving parents a heart attack. And we know that that's a genetically influenced kind of way, the way brains are wired toward reward seeking versus thinking through long-term consequences, or, the risks associated. It shows up very early. But by the way, all kids, of course, tend to be lower on this because the parts of our brains that help us think through consequences don't fully develop until we're in our mid-20s. So hang in there, parents, it'll get better. But some kids are, of course, more impulsive than others. And those are the kids that are then more at risk for ADHD, for behavior problems, for experimenting with risky substances, and also now for things like excessive gambling, gaming, social media use, all these digital kind of platforms that also are programmed to essentially be rewarding. And so that's kind of the last big genetically influenced dimension. And the really good thing from a parental or a prevention perspective is that because we are born with kind of these unique genetic dispositions, when we recognize what's going on early, we can also put in place skills, for example, to with risk taking, to help reduce risk taking in, in highly risky situations, to learn some impulse control, to learn to think things through a bit more. And that we know that when you do that, it reduces the likelihood that as they get older, they will, for example, get involved in substance use or some of these other things we worry more about as they kind of age into adolescence and adulthood.
Let's say addictions. How does extroversion or introversion play a role into that?
Actually, extroversion is loosely associated with substance use outcomes, particularly among emerging adults, among young people, because what we know is more extroverted individuals tend to want to be around other people. And a lot of social settings, particularly in universities, among young people, tend to be social settings where there is alcohol and or other drugs now. And so that access and acceptance that sometimes happens, among parties and groups of other folks, that is how extroversion can be related to substance use. And the strongest association is actually among young people.
What can DNA tests tell us about addiction?
So we have made radical progress over the last 5 or so years in identifying these specific genetic variants. We can now add them up, weight them by their effect sizes, and essentially create these genetic risk scores for any individual. They account for about 10 to 15% of the variance in outcomes. So they are not determinative, right? They do not indicate that you definitely will develop a problem. And there's clearly lots of genes and environmental factors involved too. What we know, though, is that when we combine these genetic risk scores with the early behaviors and the environments that we also know are most predictive of who develops problems, we can powerfully differentiate how at risk an individual is for developing a problem with a substance use disorder or other addiction.
How can someone use a DNA test information about addiction to help them avoid addiction or to get over an addiction?
Because we are born with our genetic code, it gives us this unique ability to understand something about the outcomes that we are most at risk for. And many, in fact, most of the medical outcomes that affect millions of individuals are things that are influenced by genes, but not caused by genes. So we say DNA is not destiny. So by knowing if you're at elevated risk, you also can take steps to reduce risk. That's essentially how we hope to use this information to prevent problems before they start.
What if someone is addicted and has a serious addiction and then learns through a DNA test that they are at high risk of being addicted? Can that assist them in some way?
Yes, in the sense that by understanding and identifying the genes involved, we also know something about how those genes influence risk for addiction. So I broadly refer to them as three big genetically influenced risk pathways. The first one is what we were talking about earlier. It's how our brains are wired to process rewards and risks. So some of us have brains that are highly sensitive and in tuned to rewards. This isn't a bad thing, by the way. Risk taking is higher in entrepreneurs and CEOs and fighter pilots, but we also know it can lead some individuals to make risky decisions surrounding substance use for their brains to be highly activated by those rewarding properties, which can lead to challenges or problems. So that's one. The other one is how our brains are wired toward anxiety proneness, depression proneness. We differ in how, quick we are to worry toward fear. Again, a little bit of anxiety is a good thing. That's why it evolved evolutionarily. It's not necessarily all bad, but if individuals don't learn effective coping strategies or have those in place, then substances can be used to essentially dampen those anxious or depressive feelings, and that can lead to problems. The third pathway, which is what I find most people think of when I talk about genetic influences on addiction, is how our bodies actually respond to drugs. So, some of us carry genes involved in the metabolism of alcohol, for example, that makes it very hard to break down this kind of toxic byproduct. That's why some people get facial flushing or they feel nauseous when they drink. That's actually highly protective. So, there are genes that influence how much we like a particular drug or how sick it makes us feel. And of course, that can be related to how much we use and likelihood of developing problems. So, returning to if you've already developed a substance use disorder, how can genetic information be useful? Well, because we can actually differentiate genetic risk across these pathways by understanding what kinds of risk pathways you might carry, what kinds of, risk factors that individual might have, we can also tailor treatment and support for recovery.
Where does someone begin to assess which DNA test to take?
So, right now, there are a proliferation of DNA tests coming onto the market, and many of them are not valid and do not represent the latest state of the science. I've actually become involved with several startup companies, and we spun off a startup company to make sure that it is the latest science that is getting to people. So, unfortunately, this is very hard for individuals to ascertain right now how good of a test something is because they all have slick websites and they all say they're evidence based and grounded in science. So, as rules of thumb, what you can think about is anything that is measuring a single gene or a small number of genes does not represent the state of the science. So, in the platform that we've built, which we call CARES, the Comprehensive Addiction Risk Evaluation System, and in the work that I've done with some other kinds of startups, like Seek Health is another one that I'm working with that wants to provide genetic information to folks about how at risk they are for alcohol problems. What we do is we are essentially creating these risk scores by scanning the genome, adding up thousands of locations, weighting them by their effect size to create these single, what we call polygenic scores. If someone is offering you genetic testing for a complex behavioral or substance use outcome that is not based on now these polygenic scores, that does not represent the state of the science. So the best risk information comes from a combination of genetics as well as these genetically influenced early behaviors and environments. That is the best way to really do a risk assessment for something like addiction or a mental health outcome.
What do you see in the future DNA testing from your perspective?
Maybe not within my lifetime, but definitely within my children's lifetimes. We will all have our DNA sequenced. It'll be a part of our medical records, and we will know how at risk we are for a variety of different things. That sounds purely like science fiction, but really it's where I think the science is absolutely going.
How did you end up deciding to go into this field?
So I was an undergraduate and I was pre-med, and I took a psychology class as an elective. And I became fascinated by the brain as the last frontier of medicine. We know so much less about disorders that are brain related, everything from ADHD to depression to substance use outcomes. And our ability to treat these outcomes is drastically different than most major medical outcomes. So we are so far behind for many of these mental health outcomes, despite the fact that they affect so many people. So 1 in 4 individuals over the age of 18 will be affected with a substance use or mental health disorder at some point in their lives. And so, to my mind, that's a grand challenge that is worth taking on. And that's really how I ended up doing research in this area.
Thank you so much for taking the time today to speak with me. It was such a pleasure to hear more about your work as always, and I need much more time with you, and so I'm glad that we can do that soon.
Curious by Nature is a production of Newswise. More than 7,000 journalists get the Newswise wires. Visit newswise.com and find out how to spread your news today.